feel like we kind of hear the term identity politics thrown around a lot in political spaces, whether that be attacks from the right or even just within the left. But I guess for the purpose of this talk, it's kind of going to be more around, how we see identity politics playing about in the left, and a lot of the movements that are happening right now. So I guess just to define identity politics, quite literally, it's just about how identity can form the base of your politics. And it's really based around this idea that because oppressed people have this lived experience of oppression, they inherently also have a political vision of how to fight that said oppression. And we see this manifest a lot in leftist movements, most relevantly with the Palestine movement at the moment, where we're not only centering Palestinians, but sometimes we're deferring all of that organizing and political strategy to those Palestinians with a lived experience. And what does this mean for those of us that may not have that kind of lived experience? That's kind of where this idea of allyship comes in, and where we have a lot of discussion about whiteness and white privilege. And it kind of comes down to if you are a white person coming into the movement, you have these inherent biases and lack of experience with racial oppression. And even in some spaces, other people of color that are not indigenous are also perceived as having this closer proximity to whiteness. And sometimes it operates in this binary of settler versus First Nations people. And it comes to this point where white people or those that are white adjacent in the movement should strive to be good allies. And that kind of means, listening to marginalized voices. It could sometimes also just imply that you're using your privilege for good, and that could mean even just putting yourself on the line for the marginalized people in the movement who can't. And yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, obviously, the positives, or how identity politics can act as a starting point for a lot of people. And also it can just really be something that's really hard to disagree with sometimes. A lot of people's experience with oppression can raise their political consciousness, and it can bring them towards activism or towards a movement. And also, the idea of wanting to be an ally comes from a good place. It comes from wanting to be respectful and inclusive, not wanting to speak over marginalized voices. And that's an amazing first step. We've seen so many people be radicalized through the Palestine movement, and it's brought this amazing new energy into the left. And, in the Palestine movement, it's ranging from people who have lived experience from the region, people who have Palestinian heritage but have since been displaced. And there's also just a lot of people that felt so compelled by what they've seen in Gaza and felt the need to join in this movement. So I guess the question that we're asking today is whether our activism ends at allyship, and if allyship is the way forward for us to defeat systemic oppression that affects us, most of us, one way or another. And yeah, I was involved in the Gaza Solidarity Encampment at UniMelb last semester, and that informs, I guess, a lot of my experience with organizing around Palestine on UniMelb campus, but it's not a new thing, and we've seen this happen time and time again, this identity politics playing out, and it's happening in campaign groups all around Melbourne right now, and I'm sure other comrades have lots of experience with years of activism. So yeah, I guess to get into the problems that we kind of encounter when it comes to identity politics, if we just look at face value, the idea of identity politics, the fact that only those with lived experience of a particular oppression have the ability to understand it and challenge it, it leads to this, idea of deference, where the strategy is then just to defer and listen to marginalized voices in the movement, or those that fit this identity criteria of being victims of certain injustice. And it also comes from this pessimism in allies' ability to truly understand and truly want to fight for the cause. And it breeds a distrust of allies and can, risk isolating the movement as a whole. I saw this with the divestment campaign at UniMelb, where we were organizing with the main Palestine activist group on campus, which was UniMelb for Palestine. And this was a group that prided themselves in being indigenous and Palestinian-led, which also meant that there was this kind of top-down structure where we had Palestinians, other Arab identities and First Nations students that formed this core organizing group, and everyone else in the UniMelb for Palestine space was effectively a volunteer. and we had no democratic structure. Instead, the actions are decided on by that core organizing team and then passed down to the volunteers to actually carry out. And this organizing structure, it comes from this pessimistic approach towards non-Palestinian and non-Indigenous people to understand their experiences, and because they don't have that lived experience, they automatically do not have the strategic vision for the campaign. And it operates, under this idea that you can't really organize and have Palestinians' best interests at heart because you just don't have that lived experience. And it creates this really strange dynamic where the strategy for allies is just to defer to the Palestinians, and it puts Palestinians on a pedestal where their strategy is correct and free of critique, and it puts all the responsibility to organize the student body on them, which, just realistically isn't possible. And, another issue that arises out of this is it kind of operates within these divisions that the ruling class actually has created. What creates and reinforces racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia? It's the ruling class and the capitalist structures. They are what benefit from our division. And the unfortunate truth is that liberation movements cannot be limited to a few minority. If we could achieve liberation in this way, where the minority alone can achieve liberation, there would be so many more oppressed groups that would be free by now. But that's not the case. And you can kind of see division happening, say with what's happening in the left with the US elections coming up. Kamala and the Democrats are threatening American voters that, if they don't vote for the Democrats, then Trump will be voted in, and that threatens the lives of all Americans. You're seeing, divisions coming up in the Palestine movement, especially between Black activists and a lot of Palestinians in the movement. And the issue is, operating within these racial divisions that once, the Black struggle is limited to Black people only and pitted against, the Palestinian liberation, that division is created by the ruling class, and it can erode the Palestinian movement as a whole, which has gained just so much traction and has become so much more than just about Palestine. It also just speaks to this danger of fragmentation, when the movements are oriented towards identity politics, where groups will just continue to shrink or break off. We're seeing it where Black activists are saying they can't work in the Palestine movement because of anti-Blackness, and Palestinians in the movement saying there's Islamophobia coming from the Black community, telling Black activists you need to take the Palestine flag out of your bio, and it becomes this toxic way of kind of ranking oppression in a hierarchical way and who suffers the most. It fails to recognize how Palestinian liberation is actually intertwined with Black liberation, and how it's within Black people's interests to fight U.S. imperialism alongside the Palestine movement to uplift their own rights in America. Yeah, and there's this focus on, when we operate within identity politics, of focusing on the interpersonal oppression rather than the systemic oppression, and it really just distorts who the real enemy is. If we're so concerned with fighting, the anti-Blackness or Islamophobia within the Palestine movement, it just leads to this split and fragmentation. While we really just need to address it to unite against the real enemy, and the real enemy is the ruling class, and the Democratic Party that supports it, the same Kamala that is standing on Israel's right to defend itself and supporting the genocide in Gaza right now, that's the same person that is, California's top cop and supports mass incarceration and the implementation of cop cities all across America. So we're not just trying, similarly, we're not just trying to fight racism within the union, but we're fighting the racism in the workplace and the racism that is enforced by management from the top down. And you call out the racism within the union, but you also recognize how you need to work together to fight that workplace racism. To fight the workplace racism, we build the union to have power over the workplace and to challenge that racism. And you overcome the interpersonal racism within the union by recognizing how you need each other to fight the systemic racism, and that's the real racism, that affects everyone. The same thing can be said about the activism on campus. The real enemy is the university and its weapons ties, how it operates to uphold imperial interests, and that's what manifests into a lot of Islamophobia and xenophobia that we're seeing on campus. And while we can recognize and encourage each other to call out interpersonal oppression, that is not what our activism is predicated on, and it's not where the activism ends. The issue with identity politics is It emerges out of the rise of social pessimism and from a world in which class has become less important, and the class struggle and politics are seen as less plausible to most people now. It doesn't view the working class as having experiences of oppression, especially if you're white. The working class, is often dismissed, or even worse, it's viewed as just holding these sexist, racist, homophobic beliefs, and therefore we just can't work with the working class. In this sense, the question of oppression is viewed as separate to the material issues that arise from capitalism. And this is a big concern because it diminishes the ability for the working class to get involved in such movements. It hinders our ability to build a broad mass movement that has the potential to really smash the system. And we can't expect everyone to come to a movement having already, decolonized their minds or, having undone all of their racist or sexist beliefs, because it's just not that easy, and it's not how we really build a movement. We believe that, becoming radicalized and growing politically, that comes through the experience of struggle, and the more radical that struggle is, the more radical the people in that struggle become. And a successful movement, that can't be limited to an enlightened few. The best way to shape people's ideas and to break down those divisions is through a shared struggle and being united against a common enemy. That common enemy is the capitalist system and the ruling class that benefit from it. We had real tangible success from building a mass movement on campus last semester to get the uni to disclose its ties to us. And unfortunately, identity politics led a lot of people to draw, the wrong conclusions of what really won us disclosure. People thought that it was the fact that the movement, was Palestinian and indigenous led, and that was the main reason for our success. But for a lot of people, for a lot of us on the ground, a lot of the success actually came from, building this mass movement from day one of the encampment, from organizing constant rallies, consistent building and drawing people in. That's what even got us to the point of being able to take Mahmoud's Hall. And when we went into Mahmoud's Hall, it was led by an autonomous group of students. It didn't necessarily come from, these organizing approaches that only come from Palestinian and indigenous knowledges, but instead it actually came from a politics that saw the power and mass numbers and its ability to mobilize more and more people. So we want to build a movement that has people coming together, not simply just because they empathize and are an ally to the plight of Palestinians, but also because they can recognize how their struggle is intricately connected to the Palestinian struggle. We're all being screwed over by the system one way or another, and that is what can ensure the longevity of the movement, and it really challenges the capitalist system as a whole. We see real power in a movement when it's able to unite multiple marginalized groups, and when it's able to unite with the working class, which has the ability to challenge the system head on. Liberation movements historically, whether that be, South African apartheid and with the Gurindji strikes, that's won through collective struggle because colonized people and the working class were united together against this bigger structure. And we're here today because, we want a free Palestine, but we can only see how that liberation is possible and how that liberation also comes with the liberation of us all. That just doesn't stop at a ceasefire. The liberation of Palestine can only really be achieved through a broad mass movement. And this requires us to be much more than just allies or cheerleaders on the sideline. That's why, identity politics can threaten to stifle the movement rather than help it progress towards liberation for all. And that's what, unites us all, and that's what we need to push for moving forward.